Dr. Dominic D'Agostino is an associate professor with tenure at the University of South Florida, where he teaches students of the Morsani College of Medicine and the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology, with a focus on such topics as neuropharmacology, medical biochemistry, physiology, neuroscience, and neuropharmacology. His laboratory develops and tests metabolic-based strategies for targeting CNS oxygen toxicity or seizures, epilepsy, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancer. This episode is a do not miss. I have followed along with Dom's work for almost a decade, and he is like no one else in the industry. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed taping it. Dom, thank you so much for joining today. I've been so excited about our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, you are like the OG keto guy. Inspired me after our Bulletproof conference to start writing a little bit about nutritional ketosis, to which I had major backlash because people didn't know what I was talking about. And they thought I was talking about ketoacidosis, to the point where, I was writing for big nutrition blogs that were posting things on Facebook, having to take things down. So I want you to debunk and kind of break down the science of ketosis. We're going to build our way up because, like I said, you're the OG in the keto space. You're the researcher that really turned me on to the benefits of ketone bodies. So I want our audience to know all about it. So can you start with the basics? Like, what is ketosis? What's happening in our body?
Sure. And just a little bit of the background. I understand your perspective, back in 2013 when we met. I had a negative view of the ketogenic diet. I went through a nutrition science program, dietetics program at Rutgers University way back in the early to mid 90s. And yeah, ketogenic diets were not very popular. They were the fad diet, but I did not even know, I was not educated on the therapeutic use, the medical use, the standard of care really for drug-resistant epilepsy. But now there's emerging applications. Actually, I don't have this as a prop here for this thing, but there's a book that for Oxford University Press. This was 4 years ago, and I just finished my last chapter. It should be coming out. It's the 100-year anniversary edition from Oxford University Press, Ketogenic Diet and Metabolic Therapies. And it has expanded over the years, not just for pediatric epilepsy, but for adult epilepsy, neurological disorders, cancer, inborn errors of metabolism. We study genetic Kabuki syndrome. We study the epigenetic effects of ketones. I have a PhD student just studying that. So it has been very exciting to see the emerging applications of this as a medical therapy. So just stating that up front, like a lot, if you search Google or PubMed, most importantly, PubMed, you see an explosion of ketogenic diet research, basic science research. And if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and just type in ketogenic diet, even if you type in, I had to do an NIH workshop on this, but if you type in ketone supplements into clinicaltrials.gov, you see something like 87 registered clinical trials. Like this did not even exist 2 years ago. Like there was nothing on there. So there is an explosion of research that's just increasing exponentially. So that's very exciting to me. There was a lot of pushback when I started doing it originally because I'm in a pharmacology department. But we found that nutritional ketosis, or being in a state of therapeutic ketosis, was more effective than the drugs that we were using to prevent the types of seizures that we're looking at. So to take a step back, the ketogenic diet is simply a macronutrient ratio of fats to protein, fat being high, protein being moderate to adequate, and then carbohydrates being low, and consuming that diet with a range of macronutrient ratios from fat being 65 to say like 90% for the clinical ketogenic diet. Protein, now we know that protein can go higher than we once thought. It was like 10%, 8 to 10%, but now adult ketogenic diets are upwards of 30% protein, and then carbohydrates being restricted to below 10% of total calories, usually fibrous carbohydrates. So you have fat, protein, and carbs in the form of fiber, really, or fibrous vegetables. So eating that will shift your physiology from being a carbohydrate burning machine to burning proportionally more fat, and then you produce these ketone bodies. But you still have glucose. So it's not like you're shifting away from glucose. The homeostatic mechanisms that maintain your blood glucose are very powerful. So your glucose will come down and insulin will come down. And that's an important thing. And the suppression of the hormone insulin is really what drives the body to make ketones. And then there's this keto adaptation, which is like a fuzzy term that people use. And it is essentially meaning that you are metabolizing, breaking down, assimilating, transporting fats and ketones at a higher rate. And this causes adaptations in the body to the enzyme systems, the transport systems. And after a period of time, we adapt our physiology to this. And it is that state that has a profound neuroprotective anticonvulsant effect. And we don't really know why. Mechanistically, we are studying that. That's like what our lab does. We don't have all the answers, but we have some interesting answers. And we also know that by shifting our physiology in this direction, it can be used to manage things like different forms of cancer, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity, appetite suppression. We study inflammatory disorders. We study a range of different things. But it's really, the ketogenic diet is simply a macronutrient ratio. It's the only diet defined by the elevation of a biomarker. So no other diet, to my knowledge, is like, can you quantify it? So the ketogenic diet, you quantify the ratios, you eat the ketogenic diet, and then if your ketones are not elevated, you are not by definition on a ketogenic diet. So we can look at, blood beta hydroxybutyrate, urine acetoacetate, which is a ketone. And what I have been experimenting with, well, I have the blood meters here. And then I have, various insulin tests and things. This is ZRT Labs, but I use different insulin tests. I'm always self-experimenting, and downstairs my breath acetone meter is charging up right now. But I find that breath ketones, the Biosense breath acetone meter, is a very effective way to really gauge your fat oxidation. So your ketones that come out of your breath, acetone, is super important in monitoring if you're fasting or on a ketogenic diet. Blood beta hydroxybutyrate is good too, but we've been doing a little more work with the breath ketones, which are really interesting. And that's really a benefit of it to being used therapeutically, because you can look at someone's ketone levels, adjust the diet to achieve different therapeutic states. And then we have ketone supplements too, which elevating ketones with a supplement can further augment the therapeutic efficacy of the ketogenic diet, especially in the context of seizures, which we study. And we have a couple of trials on that.
I love that so much. I kind of want to break down everything that you just went through. I actually remember back it was right around the conference when the first keto breathalyzer came out that plugged in and a USB into my computer, and the software was always crashing, but I didn't feel like that was the technology that we needed. So let's talk about the technology that you just dropped. So we have the ketometer, which is blood ketone levels. We have the breathalyzer. So what ranges are we looking for if we're using blood versus breath?
So the two meters that are on the market now that are most popular, I would say, are Abbott Labs makes the Precision Extra meter, and that's pretty good. I mean, we've published quite a bit with that. And then the Keto Mojo meter, which is not as much publications on this, and the ketone levels seem to be slightly higher than if you do a lab assay, whereas the ketone levels on the Abbott are slightly lower. So I like to use both of these products. And the clinical range of ketosis is 0.5 millimole per liter. So for someone eating a high carbohydrate diet, they typically would have to fast about 20 to 24 hours to get their levels of ketones at or above that range. And they would, be, and then you'd get a red flag kind of if you fast for more than 24 hours. If you're on a low carb diet, you may achieve it a little bit faster. And then clinical ketogenic diets typically achieve ketosis in the range of like 2 to 3 millimolar. And the kids have very good seizure control with that level of ketosis. So the breath, Readout Health makes an FDA-approved breath ketone meter, and it's called Biosense. And that one is much more research behind it than the other ones. And that's what I've been using. And it has a nifty app too. And they call it ACEs, or the acetone levels. And 10, an ACE reading of 10 will correlate to a blood beta hydroxybutyrate level of 1. So, but I found that, and I've reported to the company that that's not the case when you're fasting, which is kind of interesting, because if you're on a eucaloric ketogenic diet, which means you're getting all the nutrition and calories that you need, then the beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate levels, you have that one beta hydroxybutyrate or millimolar to 10 ACEs. Typically that ratio stays. But in the context of a calorie deficit or fasting, and I have that ratio here, and I go into a calorie deficit or I'm fasting, my body becomes very hungry for beta hydroxybutyrate because we use that for fuel. So we tend to clear it from the blood faster, like sort of similar to someone with type 2 diabetes. If they do exercise, they have insulin independent glucose disposal. So their muscle tissue sucks up glucose. Whereas the fat oxidation will be accelerated if you go and exercise, and my acetone levels go up because, acetone is really not being used as a fuel, and it's kind of like a metabolic exhaust. So acetone is actually a very good indicator for fat oxidation. And I realized this. I did a lot of personal studies, and then looking at the data of other people, that acetone starts to climb up if you put someone in a calorie deficit on a ketogenic diet, or if they're fasting, or if you do exercise that burns fat. It correlates very well with acetone. So if someone's using, ketosis to monitor fat burning, I would advise for them to actually measure. It's more rewarding too to watch the acetone levels go up, because it's correlating with fat oxidation. Whereas if you're in a calorie deficit and you're exercising and you're burning up the beta hydroxybutyrate, that those ketone levels stay pretty low. So I think, this is sort of, I wouldn't have said that a year ago, but after, doing many measurements with the devices, and then come to find out there's research that supports that anyway, so that I somehow missed. But I would advocate for actually breath. And then you don't have to stab your finger. You just puff into the device and it gives you a number, and it goes into the app and it quantifies it. So it's a pretty cool. I would encourage people to check out Readout Health. They're mostly focused on the medical market, but I think they may cater to the consumer that are interested in the technology. And it ends up saving a lot of money too, because you don't have to buy all the strips.
Yeah, the ketone strips they're pretty pricey.
Yeah.
And you get excited about, being your own little lab rat. So you're pricking your finger all day long if you are trying to get into ketosis. And how frustrating is it that if you are working out and burning fat, your numbers are going down or not as high as they would be. So measure your exhaust, get the, it sounds like get the breath monitor. Okay, great. So can we dive a little bit into exogenous ketones and using beta hydroxybutyrate in powder form, what the research is showing there, how people should use those. I remember, it's Keto OS? That was from like a couple of years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And then Perfect Keto.
Keto. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are, how would someone use that, and what are you showing in the research?
Yeah, that's a really active area of research right now. I'd encourage people to go to clinicaltrials.gov if they actually want to get a real-time snapshot of all the clinical trials that are being conducted right now. Everything from, there's of course like seizure trials and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's, I believe. And we have one for Angelman syndrome, one for looking at CNS oxygen toxicity at Duke University, with more of the military stuff that we do. But there's things for like alcohol withdrawal. Of course, there's like the rare metabolic disorders where ketones can be effective. Things like pyruvate dehydrogenase complex deficiency, and, glucose transporter type 1, things with really long names. So we started studying this in about a little over 10 years ago. And we tested a beta hydroxybutyrate ester for seizures, and it was not effective. But so I started exploring different ways to elevate other ketones like acetoacetate. And we settled on a ketone ester that elevated acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate. And come to find out, acetoacetate has more of the anti-seizure effects. So we saw a really profound suppression of seizures when we gave this particular ketone ester. And then we compared it to other things, but kept going back to this particular molecule. So, we've published a lot on that. We've actually submitted another manuscript today on that. And then we're working on clinical trials too. So that's a ketone ester. And then out of that research, we kind of had the idea, well, these ketone molecules can be delivered not in the free acid form because they're not like, you can't put that into a powder, and they're kind of acidic. But if we combine them with a mineral like or electrolyte like sodium, potassium, magnesium, or calcium, you can make a ketone salt. So this idea came up, and I've communicated with a chemist that was, keen on this, science, and we worked together to create various ketone salts. And then that sort of spawned the whole industry of, and then we had the university licensed various formulations that we developed, and then we tested. Some things worked, some things didn't work. The things that worked, the university creates the patents, and they have the patents on, and then they have licensing partners, like, that you'll see products with the patent on it. And some of those companies have partnered with our university to have, the combination of beta hydroxybutyrate salts. Beta hydroxybutyrate salt by itself is not as effective as if you combine it with a ketogenic fat. So the idea, what we find is that beta hydroxybutyrate salts, when they're combined with medium chain triglycerides, that combination is much better than either one by itself. And then the fat from the MCTs delays gastric absorption and shifts the pharmacokinetic curve, we say, to the right, where we have a greater sustainment of ketosis for, several hours, 2, 3, 4, sometimes up to 8 hours, depending upon the formulation. So we, as we tested various things, then we started moving those formulations into clinical trials, or preclinical trials, I should say. So we looked at anxiety disorders, where we put rodents on like a catwalk thing, where it's called elevated plus maze, where if you think of like a person walking out on a catwalk in front of an audience, or with the rat, the device, it's actually, you could fall off either side.
It's like a tightrope.
Yeah, so there's some anxiety associated with that. And what we find is that when ketones are given to various rodent models, it decreases their fear response in a way that makes them also more social, less anxious. It attenuates the fear response. We've put them on treadmill-like devices, and we run them, and we can either increase their physical performance. They run longer, not necessarily faster, but they can run longer, so the endurance is improved. Other ones showed no benefit, but depending upon the formulation, you can get a benefit. We've looked at many different seizure models, absent seizures, which are seizures that people have, but they're not convulsing. So they're just kind of like zoning out. And we've published probably 3 or 4 publications just on like absent seizures, and showing the role of inflammation too. So inflammation can drive neurodegenerative diseases. And when you induce inflammation with something like lipopolysaccharide, also known as LPS, it can cause more seizures. And we find that that ketones delivered to these animal models can prevent seizures associated with inflammation. And yeah, we're working on different animal models. We did an Angelman syndrome model, which is genetic disease, and now we're doing Kabuki syndrome, which is actually another rare genetic disease, which tends to be responsive to a ketogenic diet. And it's responsive, we believe, not because ketones are an alternative energy substrate, but in the context of this disease, the ketones are activating different epigenetic pathways that in the mouse model, it silences the pathology. So the idea is, at least the ketogenic diet does. So now this is work that was done at Johns Hopkins, and we acquired the rights for the animal model, which we bred up. And now we're trying to reproduce, and it's really important to try to reproduce other people's findings, to reproduce the ketogenic diet studies with ketone supplementation. So that's a project for one of my PhD students actually now, looking at epigenetic. I never thought when I got into this that we would be looking at ketones as epigenetic modifiers. But so the current project is that, and we have several current projects, but that's just, and then we've done quite a bit of cancer research too, that we do at the Moffitt Cancer Center, which is pretty close to USF. So we partner with them in different capacities.
Can you talk about some of the cancers where ketones are supportive of either suppression or healing, or what are you finding in that research?
Yeah, and I encourage people to go to clinicaltrials.com, .gov, I'm sorry, it's a government website where the trials are actually registered. So, and I say that because a lot of people come to me and ask about doing it themselves. And I encourage them to do it under medical supervision and actually to enter a clinical trial so we can use that person's data. It's really important. It's not like a utilitarian thing. It's more like you have better management if you work with people. And sometimes those clinical trials are using the ketogenic diet in the context of radiation or chemotherapy. And some people don't want to do that. And they think maybe that I'm of the opinion to do the ketogenic diet instead of standard of care. And that's not, I would not advise. Under certain circumstances, there are like advanced metastatic cancer or certain forms of brain cancer where it's questionable if the standard of care is helping. But what we think is that the standard of care is very useful and is more useful in the context of being on a ketogenic diet that is well formulated and personalized to the patient. Because a ketogenic diet will lower the hormone insulin and IGF-1, which is a driver for cancer. It lowers glucose availability to the tumor. It increases ketones, which we think have neuroprotective effect for people that are undergoing, there's something called chemo brain. When you go through chemo and radiation, it really impacts your cognitive function, and being in a ketogenic diet can protect your normal healthy cells against chemo and radiation. So, and that's most of the trials that I know of. There might be a few that are using the ketogenic diet as a standalone or with other natural sort of things, but the majority of clinical trials are actually using the ketogenic diet to further augment other therapeutic modalities, right? So, and that's kind of what we did, but we'd use the first paper that we studied was the ketogenic diet and hyperbaric oxygen therapy, because we develop unique technologies in our lab, which are like microscopes and different pieces of equipment that are housed inside hyperbaric chambers. Then we study cells, tissues, and animals in the context of graded levels of oxygen and pressure. So we do a lot. We have a hyperbaric biomedical research lab. So that's like my background kind of. So my postdoctoral fellowship was developing hyperbaric atomic force microscopy. So it's like, it's kind of like a cool thing, but it's very scientific and mechanistic. And I felt, I was doing science for the sake of science, which is great, but I wanted to move away from a lot of the cellular and molecular stuff and to do like a lot of these preclinical trials, which the first one was actually taking mice and putting them on a ketogenic diet and giving them hyperbaric oxygen 3 times per week, 2.5 atmospheres of oxygen delivered for 1 hour, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And when the animals were on a ketogenic diet and they had tumors, which were very rapidly metastasizing throughout the body, we noticed that they could survive considerably longer and that the tumor burden was much less. And this particular animal model was the most aggressive one that we knew of. And my colleague at Boston College said, if you could cure cancer in this model, then, because they had tried chemotherapy and things, and very few things were effective, that if you can, extend lifespan and cure cancer in this model, then you're making a lot of progress. And the first few publications we did, PLOS One, which was hyperbaric oxygen and ketogenic diet, and then International Journal of Cancer, and then a few others after that, and a few review articles, really talking about this idea of targeting the Warburg effect. The Warburg effect in cancer is this idea coined by Dr. Otto Warburg, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in metabolism with cytochromes of the mitochondria. And what he observed is that defective mitochondria, or oxidative phosphorylation, if you can remember your biochemistry class, defective mitochondria that do not produce robust levels of ATP like they should is sensed by the cell as an energetic crisis, and that kicks on various oncogenes that can upregulate glycolysis, right, or sugar metabolism. And that's why many different cancer cell lines and many different tumors have very high rates of glucose metabolism. And that's why it's the underlying reason why we can use something called a fluorodeoxyglucose PET scan to image the location and also the aggressiveness of that tumor. But we don't use that technology to target the tumor. So oncologists are very keen to point out that the FDG PET scan is like the gold standard of identifying the aggressiveness of your tumor and the location, but then we don't use that information to like target the actual tumor. So that's what the ketogenic diet does. So it lowers insulin. Insulin stimulates glycolysis in the tumor. So if you lower it, that's a good thing. It takes the foot off the gas pedal of cancer growth, and it makes the cancer more vulnerable to other modalities, especially ones that increase cancer cell death by oxidative stress. So if we lower glucose availability to tumors, the tumors have like really high levels of endogenous antioxidants, and that's why they can protect themselves. But if you restrict the glucose and the insulin, it decreases their endogenous antioxidant capacity and makes them more vulnerable to chemotherapeutic agents and radiation, because these modalities actually kill the tumor through an oxidative stress mechanism. So it kind of weakens the defense, so it makes it weak, so we can target and hit that. And it seems to do it in a tissue, and it makes the tumor selectively vulnerable when you compare it to healthy tissue, because the tumor is so dependent upon glucose. And also the tumor has very high levels of oxidative stress because the mitochondria are defective. So with hyperbaric oxygen, if you reverse tumor hypoxia and hyperoxygenate the tumor, you push more oxygen through the electron transport chain of mitochondria that are defective. So you produce proportionally more superoxide anion, which is a precursor to more reactive species like hydroxyl radical, which then kicks on all this autophagy and a lot of cell death pathways that are otherwise silenced in cancer cells. So it pushes it over the threshold. So essentially that's what we were seeing. And I didn't really understand a lot of the biochemistry until we were actually doing the experiments. As we were getting the data, I was reaching out to different cancer biologists, and they say, oh yeah, what you're observing is kind of what we call the Warburg effect. And it's not really talked about much, but I found out experimentally and through observation that it's actually a real thing. And it motivated me to get off of the track of neuroscience seizure studies and actually create another track in my lab, which I recruited a very sharp PhD student, Angela Poff, now Dr. Angela Poff. And then she made that her PhD project. So she had a number of publications and she had like a very high personal interest in this, in cancer, for like family reasons to really study this and then help to elucidate the role of the ketogenic diet. And now we work with different, clinics and stuff that are setting up clinical trials.
I love it so much. That was like taking me back to like biochem and also giving me the mechanism of action of tumor growth and how we're making these tumor cells vulnerable. Just for people listening, I think if you haven't heard, because I spent about 8 years in cancer and genetics before coming into starting my own private practice in nutrition. The PET scan is the gold standard. And so I think the best way for people to imagine it is to know that the imaging of PET scan is to look for like the little Pac-Man. Like how aggressive is that Pac-Man eating that glucose or that sugar and growing? And so you're basically, what you basically said in layman's terms was, and obviously you said it in a way more eloquent way, but if the cancer is growing off of sugar and we can image it and see it because of the sugar, like because of, that sugar and how fast that cancer is basically gobbling up that sugar like a little Pac-Man, but then we don't treat that way. The ketogenic diet takes away the sugar, it decreases insulin, it decreases those growth factors, it makes it vulnerable because it doesn't have the sugar to then create the antioxidants to make it more protective, correct?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're basically making it vulnerable to kill it, but your healthy cells can use ketones. They're anti-inflammatory to those healthy cells, protective of those healthy cells. And you're basically saying, okay, body, the sugar's gone. There's no protective mechanism on these tumor cells. Now get after it with chemotherapy and radiation, which makes sense why you would recommend standard of care with a ketogenic diet, because you're just protecting your healthy cells, creating that, that antioxidant effect or the protective effect, and then making these cancer cells more vulnerable. Is that correct? Did I grab all that?
Yeah, you did. Well, there's a lot of nuance that needs to be appreciated. So we have a vision of creating a completely non-toxic metabolic therapy. So it would involve a toolbox of things. The ketogenic diet just sets the stage. And then some cancers are responsive to hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And then there's a whole toolbox of metabolic drugs. And some you may have heard of, like, metformin. Like, we've done, one of my PhD students, he just studied metformin, another dichloroacetate, 2-deoxyglucose, 3-bromopyruvate, lonidamine. All these things target different glycolytic pathways, like the hexokinase 2 enzyme, which tends to be, we have it, but then if we get cancer, it gets astronomically upregulated and is part of the energy generating mechanism of that tumor. So if we can sort of site specifically, target that enzyme, but it becomes a little bit tricky because energetic areas of the body, like the heart and the brain, may also use that enzyme. So you have to titrate the dosage so it's not toxic. So some of the tools that we are using that we believe could be part of a non-toxic therapy have the potential to be toxic, even oxygen. So my grants through the last 15 years is actually, the title of my grants for the military is oxygen toxicity seizures. So oxygen is toxic. So oxygen will cause a seizure. And oxygen toxicity is a limitation for our Navy SEAL divers who use a closed circuit rebreather. Oxygen toxicity is also a limitation of hyperbaric oxygen therapy that has 14 different FDA approved applications, like decompression sickness, ischemic wounds. If you have carbon monoxide poisoning, you are put inside a chamber. And if you could hyperoxygenate someone at a higher level, you have a better chance of saving that person from carbon monoxide exposure, because the oxygen pushes the carbon monoxide molecule off hemoglobin better. So what we are developing tools to prevent the seizures from high oxygen concentrations, and ketone esters seem to be in our hands better than anticonvulsant drugs, better than anything else. So, which is amazing, because you're taking a metabolite that the body makes anyway, and you can deliver it in a bioidentical form. And kind of like, I think creatine monohydrate is one of the best underrated supplements out there. And it's kind of boring. It's like a cheap supplement. It's very effective. So we make creatine and then we can deliver it. And I don't think about this as being an unnatural thing, because it's something that the body makes naturally. You can consume creatine in a shake. It's actually in something that I'm drinking right here. And you can elevate the creatine stores in the body, and then it becomes a pretty profound performance enhancer. Not just people use it for lifting, but creatine is actually like a nootropic. It's like, it can actually enhance your brain energy. And if you're in a sport where you could get traumatic brain injury, having creatine elevated, I think, is important. So ketones are kind of like the next creatine, and they are readily used by the mitochondria, where creatine is like rapid energy for like lifting things, and under hypoxia, it's very effective, creatine. Whereas ketones are burned by cells that have healthy mitochondria in the presence of oxygen. And cancer cells lack the metabolic flexibility to use ketones as an energy source, because remember, their mitochondria are defective. And this applies specifically to cancer cells that are very aggressive, because they present with very high rates of glycolysis. And if you cut the cancer cell in half and look at it, the mitochondria look all messed up. The cristae inside the mitochondria, where the actual ATP is being generated, are dysregulated, and it's sort of something like crystallysis. You see it's totally broken down. And because of that, the mitochondria of tumor cells are sort of repurposed for biosynthetic processes, but not so much energetic processes. So we can leverage that information to develop a comprehensive metabolic-based therapy that really targets that sort of molecular cellular phenotype and genotype too, as you know more about the genes of the cancer. But that's more of a controversial area that's still in development. But metabolically, they present with a very ubiquitous metabolic phenotype, which is elevated rates of glycolysis, high rates of, sugar metabolism, specific pathways that are upregulated that we know we can target. So we're very interested in moving the preclinical science into the clinic now.
I love it. Your work is really, I mean, it's so powerful, and it's definitely, I'm so hopeful for non-toxic treatments, and just learning more about our biology so that we can use it to our advantage. It's amazing. A couple more questions before we go today. I know your time is valuable, and you have a 5-year anniversary to go celebrate. So I would like to know, for people who don't have epilepsy and seizures, who don't have cancer, who haven't had traumatic brain injury, when should they be supplementing with ketones? Should they be supplementing with ketones? What are the basic benefits of that? And we can get into your day and how you use ketones and how you use glucose monitoring and all that good stuff.
Good question. Probably the one I get most often, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I've been very cautious to recommend people use exogenous ketones, although I've been using them for a decade or more, on and off, and testing my blood and things like that. And now there's, trials. I just saw a trial yesterday, I believe, by Jeff Volek. He was combining ketones with a ketogenic diet. Maybe it was calorie restricted too, and showed a trend towards an increase in preservation of muscle, and when we diet, our metabolic engine is our skeletal muscle mass. So that's really important, not only just making us look good, but how we function, and it actually regulates our metabolism. So ketones are by nature anti-catabolic. And I think the reason why we could survive fasting is that we can convert fat into ketones, and then ketones can keep our brain, which sucks up a huge amount of energy, but fats don't really transport to the brain very effectively. MCTs do, but it's kind of interesting, but not long chain fats. So that energetic demand is met by an elevation of ketones, and it prevents the skeletal muscle mass from being broken down to liberate the gluconeogenic amino acids. So it's anti-catabolic from that perspective. So for people, what that means, the take-home message would be that if you want to lose weight, you have to create a calorie deficit. So, for years, people have said the ketogenic diet creates a metabolic advantage, and you burn more calories and you can eat whatever you want. And that's really not the case. You do lose some calories because we do pee out ketones. I mean, you can measure them, and that's a carbon source of energy. And we're breathing out acetone, right, into the universe. So that's essentially, we are, breathing out calories, and that doesn't happen when you're on a high carb diet so much, right? Unless you have really high diabetes and you're peeing out glucose. But the important sort of idea here is that if you do go on a ketogenic diet, you need to pay attention to total calories. And if you want to go on a weight loss diet, and it's very effective in regards to appetite regulation and also blood sugar control. And if your blood sugar is controlled, and I use a CGM device, it's on the back of my arm here. I use the Levels Health app, and
so do I.
It's amazing. So it gives you, I don't know how for testing for a self-experimenter, it's absolutely essential. Yeah. That Wear CGM and the Levels app is just incredible. And those guys are just doing some amazing things. But you can, a CGM device can just show you the benefits of low carb and ketogenic diet, because my glucose is stable and flat. And when my glucose is stable and flat, my energy is very smooth and constant throughout the day. And I become a better researcher, a better, husband, I have more energy to do the things I want to do. So it kind of makes me better. And I think, I started doing the ketogenic diet when I entered a tenure track professorship, and it just made me more productive. And I think when people ask me why I do the ketogenic diet, if I don't have epilepsy or these other things, I do it from a logistical standpoint, because I can go hours without eating. I still make sure I get the calories that I need, especially if I'm training. And, so supplementing with ketones is a way to further elevate ketone levels, which have important signaling effects, anti-inflammatory effects, and now we know epigenetic effects. Now, instead of ketone esters, which still taste really bad, I have capsules here for that we're using for our like clinical trials, but the ketone salt supplements have actually been developed and are formulated now to actually taste really good. So I'm not completely impressed with the ketone salts that are on the market just due to GI tolerability. There are ways to formulate ketone salts, and that could allow you to get levels of ketones similar to esters. So we're working on that now. But I think they are a valuable tool, and the price has come down. So I encourage people to experiment with them, especially if they're transitioning into a ketogenic diet. It can help fill the gap and get your ketones elevated. But I would suggest using a product that formulates beta hydroxybutyrate salts with MCT, or you can buy them separately and mix them together, and you'll get more benefits that way. But yeah, I think we'll have to keep our eyes on the clinical trials. Because I have sort of a conflict of interest in this, because I've developed various, patents and things like that. I try not to, if anything, I try to undersell it. And I just tell people, if they ask me, or if they actually challenge some of the things I say, I just point them to the peer-reviewed literature and then the clinical trials that are in process. Even there's clinical trials on COVID-19 and ketones, because they could help attenuate the cytokine storm. So for exercise performance, I think there's a valid application, but it has not been proven. The benefits seem to be pretty small, but when it comes to brain health, energy, appetite suppression, neuroprotective effects, regulating blood glucose, of all the things that I mentioned, I think the lowering of blood glucose is probably one of the most profound things that ketone salts do. And we don't know why, but we think the liver is like the brain, or the master regulator. It's like the boss of the body, right? The liver. And when you consume ketones orally, and this is important because if you inject them, like a couple of mouse studies they did, and they might not see a lowering glucose, but when you consume them orally, it's telling the liver that you have enough calories, or that you are burning enough fat. And then the liver tends to decrease the release of glucose, either from gluconeogenesis or what's called glycogenolysis. So the liver stores glycogen, and it like decreases the breakdown of that glycogen, and also prevents gluconeogenesis in a way that brings your blood glucose down. So using a CGM in Levels Health, I've been able to clearly kind of show that. And that's one of the really interesting things for people with type 2 diabetes, or people, and relatively healthy people, have these huge postprandial excursions in their blood glucose after they eat a meal. And if they were to have, I kind of notice this with apple cider vinegar too. If consume that prior to a meal, it can bring it down. And I have some thoughts on why that happens. But if you have ketone salts prior to a meal or with a meal, it'll attenuate that spike in blood glucose and help normalize your blood glucose. So that could be like one of the benefits too. And if you combine apple cider vinegar with a ketone salt, or exogenous ketone product, that could further enhance it. So these are things that we've, demonstrated in our mouse models and rat models. And now experimentally, I'm an N of 1, but we have people in the lab that do it. And now you see publications coming out validating what we've kind of been looking at for a decade now.
I love it so much. It just totally applicable tools for people, and giving them the science behind why it's happening. I am definitely going to try ketone salts with a little apple cider vinegar, because I love apple cider vinegar, and something I'm obsessed with blood sugar balance. I know the benefits of bringing, having a low flowing elongated curve versus this like a roller coaster Montezuma's revenge of post-meal glucose levels. And I've seen it benefit my clients from appetite regulation to, even being able to focus at work and better sleep. Like the benefits are just there. And so you're just leveling up on top of blood sugar balance with an anti-inflammatory tool that also gives you another form of fuel, which is just so awesome. So are there any products that I know you probably, they're all probably being licensed from your work, but are there any
the
favorites?
University owns them, but well, there's ones that I use personally, and some of them are not licensed. So there's and they go by different names and they change their names now. But Keto Science, I think they used to be Ketogenics,
Yep.
and you can even get them in Walmart. I think Perfect Keto's a decent brand. Keto Logic is pretty good. These are all things that we've sort of tinkered with in the lab and tested, and that you'll find like in my shelf. Prove It was one of the first to come to market. They are like a network marketing company. They have a pricey product, but it's a very good product. Some of their products are pretty good. But like I said, I'm not fully there. People have GI issues to a lot of these ketone salt products, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So we have been for like 4 years formulating different, like using magnesium beta hydroxybutyrate and different, amino acid salts and other things. So I think we have a couple formulas that in the pipeline that have a lot of potential, even when compared head to head with a ketone ester. Not sure like when if they'll come out or when they'll come out, but I think the take home message is that you don't need to consume a nasty taste in ester. And there's a lot of potential for ketone salts in the market. And then the science is really supporting not only the therapeutic applications, but like, we work with the military operational functions. So it's neuroprotective. It protects you against oxidative stress. It enhances performance resilience, which is performance under like environmental extremes, like high pressure oxygen or low pressure oxygen. So that's where these things tend to shine. If you are perfectly normal, healthy, robust, and fit, ketone salts, ketone products may give you a slight edge. I mean, if you're an advanced athlete, that 1% can be beneficial. But usually like when people take them, they don't really notice like they say, yeah, I have a little bit more energy and my appetite's suppressed. So I adhere to my ketogenic diet better. So that's probably one of the main applications. But it's kind of like creatine. When you start taking it, you don't immediately notice it. But if I'm bench pressing or something, after about a week to 2 weeks, I'm getting an extra rep or two. So that's what I would say with the ketone supplements. Like you take it for a week or two, and then you might get like an extra rep in. You have a little bit more sustained energy throughout the day. So,
Got
and then
it.
when combined with caffeine too, it seems to give a good kick. So the combination of ketones and caffeine together are kind of like synergistic. And I say that not just anecdotally, but the science kind of supports that too.
So ketones, caffeine, and some MCT fats sounds like the
Yeah.
perfect little pre-workout morning blend to
Yep.
bridge you to that post-workout meal
Yep.
in a ketogenic state. Perfect.
Yes,
That's an
exactly.
awesome takeaway. And before that post-workout meal, or with that post-workout meal, a little apple cider vinegar.
Hmm. Exactly.
Awesome takeaways today, Dr. Dom. I can't thank you enough for being a guest and for all the work that you do in the space. I've followed along for, coming up on a decade. So your
Oh,
work
that's
is
awesome.
pretty
Thank you.
profound, and it's just awesome what you're doing out there. So thank you for everything.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. I
Yeah.
like being on. Yeah.
Where can people follow along?
Ketonutrition.org is our informational website. So we have a blog, there's products, you ask about products, and we have some products on there. We've only put products on there that I personally use or test. And there's more information on there about, the science of what we're doing. And we have a newsletter too. So if you go to ketonutrition.org and sign up for the newsletter, and we're usually talking about our latest research, our publication, products we like, conferences that are coming up. If I buy, sometimes I test different things that are not ketogenic. Like I think we had chicken coops. So I'm looking at a book and various books that people have. I like to read them and promote them in the newsletter too. To support the community.
I love it so much. Well, we'll definitely put all these notes in the show notes, links to everything. You guys go follow along with Dr. Dom. And if you try any of his tips, let me know in the comment.